This week we start a new book, Devarim, or in English, Deuteronomy, which literally means repetition of the law. And indeed, you barely get in a few verses when you hear a story that is repeated already from just a couple months ago, the one of the 12 scouts sent out to assess the land of Israel. While the words are not exactly the same as it was in Numbers, the main gist of the story is, even though all 12 scouts saw the exact same land and people in front of them, 10 of them came back despondent, overwhelmed, sure that there was no way they could enter the land, filled with giants and fortified cities. Only 2 of the 12, Caleb and Joshua, had faith that they could enter, given all that God had already done for them. They saw possibilities. This story, which is repeated here in Parshat Devarim, has an extra resonance as it always falls before Tisha B'Av, which is Monday night, a day that commemorates the destructions of the temples in Jerusalem and other tragedies of the Jewish people. Because guess what day the spies brought back their damning report? The Mishnah says, on Tisha B'Av, of course. In other words, the rabbis want to make a direct link between the tragedies of our people coming from our sense of hopelessness in our fear. The spies even suggest we should go back to Egypt, preferring enslavement and oppression over fear of the unknown. I don't know about you, but I think Tisha B'Av is hitting a little different for me this year. I feel much more like the anxious and fearful spies in the wake of the destruction of October 7th and in the rising anti-Semitism worldwide in its aftermath. But one of the things that has helped keep me hopeful and afloat has been a WhatsApp group I have with a sisterhood of 5 rabbis. We live in far-flung cities, Los Angeles, Boston, Paris, Jerusalem, and New York. But the challenges we face are surprisingly similar, and we share the same dreams ultimately for Israel and for the wider Jewish community. After October 7th, we decided we really needed to meet in person to give each other strength. And 2 weeks ago, we gathered in Provence. It's a midway point for us. Plus, a congregant generously offered us his old farmhouse, and the lavender is still in bloom. So, we were sitting there, the 5 of us, with our guide, Shifra, under 2 enormous pine trees, talking about our challenges, our families, Israel a lot, and how we want to lead in this moment. It was particularly resonant for us to be in Provence, which has had a Jewish presence since at least the Middle Ages. And in the 14th century, when King Philip evicted the Jews from France, the Pope, who was at that point seated in Avignon, did you know that? Not in Rome. He gave Jews asylum in Provence, and they were known as the Papal Jews. And for centuries, Jews settled in 4 main towns in Provence, which they called the Arba Kihilot, the 4 cities, recalling the sacred Arba Kihilot of Israel, which are Jerusalem, Tiberias, Sfat, and Hebron. Now, the French rabbi in our sisterhood, you probably guessed, it's Delphine Horveleur, who was once an intern at Central Synagogue 17 years ago. She arranged for us to see the sanctuary or the synagogue, the old synagogue in Cavillon, which is one of the Arba Kihilot in Provence. Now, while Jews had been protected in these 4 cities, they were still, of course, discriminated against, only allowed to do 3 professions, and only allowed to live on 1 street. The Jew street. Rue Hebraique. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing the French right. Okay. This was a street that had a dead end on one side and a gate that locked on the other at night. Cavillon once had a sizable Jewish community for the area, complete with all the things a Jewish community needs: a synagogue, a cemetery, a mikveh, and a matzah oven. Yes, that actually still exists. Now, because Delphine is a famous rabbi and a best-selling author in France now, if you didn't know that. Her inquiry about our visit created a bit of a buzz, and the mayor of Cavillon herself and an entourage personally greeted our group and accompanied us and opened up the synagogue for us. Sadly today, there is not a single Jew left in Cavillon, but the non-Jewish tour guide had done a lot of homework in order to tell us about the history of this once vibrant community. She showed us that right outside the door of the sanctuary, the synagogue had 6 tzedakah boxes. Looked like that. One for each of the 4 communities that I named in Israel, and which they sent money to. Even though most of them will never visit any of those Arba Kehilot, they felt a sacred connection to the Arba Kehilot in Israel. And if you zoom in here, you can see that one actually says Tiberias. You see that? Tiberia, if you can see the Hebrew letters. And the last 2 boxes of the 6, one was for their poor and one was to bury their dead. Now we entered into the sanctuary, which is now a museum, on the 2nd floor of the building. And you can see they have a very sophisticated security system. Yeah. I think that key is literally from the Middle Ages, and I'm not joking. That is how you open the door. And yes, we entered. You can see that the sanctuary is a small jewel box created in a French Rococo style. Because the Jews were not allowed to be builders, their synagogues were built by the same craftsmen who built the churches at the time. Now, what you see there is the main worship floor, which seated about 100 people could stand in that space. And there were staircases that you can't see here that went up 2 sides up to a balcony space. This is the balcony looked like. It was quite beautiful. And so I asked, okay, is that where the women stand, up in the balcony? And the tour guide explained, no, that's the rabbi's bima up there. He would preach from up there down to the men gathered on the floor. So he said, so where were the women? That's where they were, literally in the basement. But she apologized and said, well, actually, when the wood wasn't treated, you could hear the rabbi through the floor. And so they were literally in the basement matzah kitchen below the sanctuary space. Now, the story could have ended here, and my sermon would have been a rather sad story about a once vibrant, protected Jewish community in Provence that has now disappeared with only a museum remaining, and how a group of 5 female rabbis from around the world came to visit this sanctuary only to realize that we would have been relegated to the basement and hearing the rabbi's sermons from below the floorboards. But in light of the story of the 12 scouts and upcoming Tisha B'Av, and the link that our rabbis make between being hopeless and becoming our own destructive force, I want to tell you how the story really ended. Now, the mayor explained that they do not usually allow people up into the balcony, old steps and insurance liability and all. But since we were a group of rabbis, and she saw that I actually brought my guitar with me, she allowed us up. And it was Friday afternoon, and the sun was just starting to lower in the sky, and we suspected that if we sang L'chad Odi up in the rabbi's balcony, we would beckon the Sabbath bride back to this abandoned sanctuary, and so we did. Now, the non-Jewish mayor of Cavillon, the tour guide, the entourage, they all looked up at us with their mouths agape. They had been careful, conscientious guardians of their town's Jewish history, but they never had actually heard real live Jews praying in this space before. And it took 500 years, but they saw a sisterhood ascend from the basement kitchen to the rabbi's balcony, ushering in the Sabbath bride into this vanished community with women's voices. No longer just a story of emptiness or destruction, we turn this into a story of redemption and possibility.